Good morning. We continue our study on Mark. We are at Mark 15, 1 to 20. And let us begin. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus and they led him away and handed him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You say so." And then the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. We'll stop there for the first 5 verses. I think what we can hear here is make sure we know that the narrative, how Mark is telling the story. So the makeshift trial, so to speak, I guess in air quotes, that happened in the middle of the night between 12 and 3 in the morning. They obviously cannot take Jesus to Pilate to continue this makeshift trial at 4 in the morning, so they have to wait till morning because Pilate, the governor, is not going to welcome their haste. So now it's morning, and they come to see Pilate. Pilate is what's called a prefect, which is sort of another name for a governor in the Roman system. He was the Roman authority. I'm not a Roman government expert, but my understanding is that there were layers of authority. Rome, because their empire was so vast and they had so many cultures and so many places that they had conquered, they found it helpful to allow the ruling people of the land that they had conquered to continue to rule as long as they were willing to abide by some Roman demands. One of those demands would have been to have troops. Another of those demands would have been to have a Roman governor like this that would be the final say. And another demand would be, of course, money. So Pilate is going to be part of that. The actual chief priests and the elders and the scribes, they are sort of the ruling people in Jerusalem, and they have a lot of power, but ultimate power rests in Pilate. And one of the things we know from history is that they didn't have the right to kill Jesus. They need Pilate to kill Jesus. So Pilate is the only one who is able to say, yes, we will crucify him. So they bring Jesus to do that. And the charge against him is that that he says he's the king of the Jews, which would mean that he's raising an insurrection. Rome has a system of who's ruling who. They have somebody called the King of the Jews. He's Herod, Herod's son, the original Herod from, or the original meaning that at the beginning of our gospel, the Herod that was in charge there has died, and now his 3 sons have kind of split up his empire. Rome has allowed him to do that, and so there's one of Herod's sons that's in charge. So if Jesus is saying he's the king of the Jews, then he is uh, upsetting the Roman rule and would be an easy thing for Pilate to kill him for. A couple things about Pilate that we know historically. It was Pilate killed people often. That was, and he was remembered by Jewish historians of the time as someone who was bloodthirsty and no great friend of the Jews. He Another thing is that Rome killed people often. There was a revolution about the time that Jesus was born in the Sea of Galilee area, and Rome strung up all sorts of people that Mary and Joseph would have had clear memories of the power um, of Rome, and they would have shared that with Jesus, obviously. And then after Jesus, when there was a revolution in Jerusalem in the 50s into the 60s, Rome killed so many people that the Jewish historian says that they started to try to innovate ways to do this, to kill more people faster, and they experimented with ways in horrific ways. And Pilate would not have fought the chief priests. If they wanted to kill a Galilean, then there would be no skin off Pilate's nose, and he would have simply okayed this. If they wanted to kill a Roman guard because of something he had done offending one of their women, then Pilate might have pushed back. But a Galilean, a peasant from the countryside, Pilate, the historical Pilate, would have just said yes to this. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't have been some makeshift trial like we had here. Um, and in Roman law, if you don't defend yourself, then you are presumed guilty. So that's a little different than Western law today. But because Jesus refuses to say anything, then he is presumed guilty. And he's not defending himself. So Pilate, even if he had an inclination to allow Jesus to be free, he Jesus doesn't do anything to help him meet that inclination. Uh, Other gospel writers are more sympathetic to Pilate. We have a story in this trial of his wife interrupting him and saying, I had a dream that he was innocent. You should let him go. And Pilate, we have another one of Pilate washing his hands of this, meaning that he doesn't want any part of it. All those may or may not have been historically accurate. I think what we can be sure, though, that we should hear is that Pilate does have the authority to do the right thing, which is to let an innocent man go. And if he thinks Jesus is innocent, then he should let him go. And Pilate chooses not to do the right thing. And at my when the men talked about this this morning, one of the things that we talked about was bearing the cross. And bearing the cross of Jesus isn't living through kind of the shitty things that happen to your life. Because we all have to live through crappy things that happen to us, and those crappy things are things that many of you who are listening have lived through. Divorce, people we love dying, major illness in our lives or in someone else's life, financial ruin. Those are horrible things. But bearing the cross is saying yes to something that you know will have bad consequences for you. That's what Jesus is doing. He's saying yes to God, even though he knows that's going to lead. Jesus has all sorts of opportunities in his other trials and in other things to defend himself. But he's saying yes to God in a way that he knows is going to end poorly for him. Pilate could have said yes to God here. He knows what the right thing to do is, but it would make his life more complicated. He would, these Jewish rulers, these hierarchy, this aristocracy in Jerusalem, sometimes he needs to push back on them, but this isn't one of those times. And so let's read on, verse 6. Now at the festival he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. And then he answered them, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews? And they shouted back, crucify him. And Pilate asked them, well, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed them over to be crucified. We'll stop right there. We're still in the midst of Passover, so that's the festival that's mentioned in verse 6. This tradition of releasing a prisoner during the festival, that Pilate would do this. There is no historical tradition like that we know of, nothing that Rome and all their records wrote down. However, it could have been something that Pilate did for a short time that Mark was aware of and that became part of the Passion story. Or it could have been something that just simply never made it into tradition. Definitely Roman governors did things like this, showed great gifts of grace to the community in the midst of one of their festivals. So this is something that could have happened, that's for sure. And Barabbas, interestingly, he is someone who is being accused of the exact same crime that Jesus is being accused of. He's being accused of being a rebel, for causing an insurrection, for challenging Roman authority in Jerusalem. So Barabbas and Jesus, in Pilate's mind, are equally equal criminals. But it seems like Pilate believes that Jesus might be innocent, whereas Barabbas isn't innocent. So he suggests maybe we release Jesus instead of Barabbas to be crucified. And so we have a picture of the king of the. We have a picture of the Jewish authorities, these scribes and elders and chief priests and that whole lot, going through the crowd and whispering, "No, don't let him do that." And so when Pilate asks them, they shout as one. And of course, we read this scripture during the Passion, um, or during Palm Sunday, Passion Sunday, the Sunday before Easter, and we take part in it to shout, crucify him, which is what they shout in verse 13 and 14. And the reason we do that in congregation, the reason we do that in the church together, is so that we all have a sense of ownership of killing Jesus. If you remember back before, I said um, that the Jewish authorities want to kill Jesus because Jesus challenges their authority, and they don't want their apple cart messed up. They don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, but you didn't get killed for claiming you were the Messiah in the Jewish authorities' day. They do believe, and that's not why they're killing him. Why they're killing him is because he's popular, and his popularity could cause a revolution in Jerusalem, and because Jerusalem's a powder keg, and they don't want a revolution in Jerusalem because ultimately the aristocracy would lose in that because they're working with Roman authorities. And so Rome is fine being in charge as long as they still get to live their lavish lifestyle. So they are killing Jesus because to say yes to Jesus would mean that they would have to sacrifice something. Pilate is killing Jesus because to go against the Jewish authorities would just complicate his life in a way that he doesn't think the life of a peasant is worth complicating. Jesus isn't worth saving to Pilate, is what we have to understand. And now the crowd, uh, they are worked up by the spectacle of it, and so they've stopped seeing Barabbas and Jesus as real people. They see him now as kind of sports figures on TV, we might say in our day. When you see someone take a huge hit in a football game and you go, "Ooh, that had to hurt," you don't actually think of a body being underneath all those pads, and yeah, it really did hurt. And that poor person is in pain right now, and he's going to be in pain for the next 3 days. You just kind of shrug your shoulders and move on. Or if you read the newspaper and you see these horrific things that are happening in Yemen, all the people that are starving there because of warring factions of Iran and Saudi Arabia, and it's all so complicated. And you shake your head and you read the next article, uh, and you don't stop and think, "Ah, there are people starving in Yemen, and we know about it, yet we're not doing anything about it." So we have the crowd shall crucify him. So we have a sense that we are part of killing Jesus too, just in our inaction in the world. Pilate has an opportunity to stop this and he doesn't. The Jewish authorities have an opportunity to stop this and they don't. The crowd has an opportunity to stop this. Everyone has an authority to do the right thing, and they don't do the right thing. And to get back what I said earlier, what bearing our cross in the world is, it's saying no to God when we have the opportunity to do the right thing in our world. And whenever we say to ourselves, "Well, you know what? God might want me to do this, but there's no way I can." and then we fill in the blank, or whenever we make judgments on people, and those judgments then release us from responsibility to serve and help them, um, then we are shouting, crucify him. Um, does that make sense? That there's all sorts of guilty parties here. And the reason in the church we take part in this is so that we realize that it's the great brokenness of the world that we are a part of. We're both victims of and we are encouragers of, that ultimately killed Jesus. I had someone in class said, so this was God's plan for Pilate to be a weak person like Pilate to be in that position to say no. And I say, you know what if this wasn't part of God's plan? What if God's plan, or God's hope, let's use that word instead, was that the Jewish authorities would embrace Jesus? Well, why not? Why wouldn't that be God's hope? What if God's hope was for Pilate to say, Jewish authorities, you are wrong about this. This is a wrong thing. I don't know anything about your God, but I have a sense of right and wrong, and you shouldn't do this, and I won't allow you to. Why wouldn't that be God's hope? Maybe all of this story would have been different if people would have done the right thing, if this crowd wouldn't have listened and gotten themselves worked up. I think that's worthy of reflection for today. Let's finish now. Then the soldiers led him into a courtyard of the palace, that's the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him, and they began saluting him, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck his head with a reed, and they spat upon him, and they knelt down in homage to him. And after mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his clothes on him, and then they led him out to crucify him. I don't know if there's much I can add to that, other than I think it's pretty self-explanatory. The whole cohort that they invited back in would have likely been these Jewish authorities that we've been talking about. Um, and all they're doing now is they are dehumanizing Jesus, which is really what we do to our enemies, isn't it? In order for us to justify hating someone, hurting someone, we have to believe that they are different than us. And so much and so often by people in authority, we are asked to believe that someone is different than us and therefore we can treat them less than human. And whether it's our government trying to convince us to go to war against this country or these people, um, or whether it's your business telling you you don't have to treat this person with respect because they're trying to rip us off. All of that is a dehumanization that I would encourage you, brothers and sisters, to push back against, and never allow you to see someone in front of you as anyone other than a child of God, because you wouldn't put a child of God with a crown of thorns so blood comes down his head, and you wouldn't take a child of God and humiliate him, and you wouldn't take a child of God and beat him and spit upon him, but you would do that to someone you have no respect for, someone you have no love for, no sympathy for, someone you've stopped believing is worth your care. And so before they do this horrific execution of crucifixion, which we'll talk about next week, um, they dehumanize them to make their own guilt lessened. Okay, this is ugly, crucifixion, but it's not really someone I need to care about. And that's what this torture is about. It's not to get information from Jesus, it's to allow them to do something ugly. And that's what they're about to do. And we'll talk about that next week. Thanks for being with me today. I appreciate your support. Email me your responses and thoughts, or post them up on the website after you view this. Thanks, and have a good week.